Hello and welcome. If you're new to my channel, my name is Josh and I talk about hobby related things, especially books and board games. And if you're not new to my channel, my name is still Josh and I still talk about hobby things. In any case, I am so grateful that you've decided to spend a bit of your very valuable time with me as I talk about the year 2021 and the books I read last year, including the worst books, the best books, and some interesting stats. So let's get to it. I never tracked the books I read until I started my YouTube channel, at which point basically every time I read a book I would make a video about it. So as a result, I have a record of all the books I read since I started my channel in late 2017. So it's interesting for me to go back and look at previous years to compare them to 2021. And 2018 was the first full year that I was on YouTube. And when I look at the number of books read in previous years, going back to 2018. In 2018, I read 6.5 books. I DNF'd one of them. The following year, in 2019, I read 10 books. However, 7 of those books were the Harry Potter series that I was reading to one of my sons, and only 3 of those books that year were specifically for my own personal reading. In 2020, I read 9 books in total, one of which was, again, a book I was reading to my son, and that time it was The Hobbit. The other 8 books included the Mistborn trilogy, so I basically read 1 book to my kid, I read the Mistborn trilogy, and then I read 5 other books for my own reading pleasure. Now, in 2021, I read a total of 16 books, all of which were for my own personal reading. So immediately, that is about double the previous best year of 8 books for my personal reading. So 2021, for me, was a big year in reading. In comparison to most other booktubers, that's nothing. You know, booktubers are reading a couple hundred books a year or whatever. In fact, I just watched a video of a booktuber who was talking about their December reading, and they talked about how they read 16 books in December, and I was like, that's as many books as I read for the entire year 2021. But for me, as you can see, 16 is a good number to read in a year. So that's the quantity of books. What about the quality? 2021 was actually the year where I first started rating books. I've never rated books previous to that, and it was really only fairly late in the year that I started to rate books. And I use a 1 to 10 rating system, which I'll put on the screen here. You can see that basically 10 is perfection, 1 is absolutely no redeeming qualities whatsoever, and then the scale goes in between there. And so, like I said, by about the midpoint towards later in the year, I started rating my books. However, for the sake of this video, I went back and gave ratings to all the rest of the books that I had read in the year. So everything I've read in 2021 has a rating from 1 to 10. And here's how those ratings break down from lowest to highest. I have 1 2 rating, a 2.5, a 5.5. I have 3 6s, 3 6.5s, 4 7s, 2 7.5s, and 1 10 out of 10. When I take those ratings and divide them by 16, the total number of books I read, I get an average rating for the year of 6.3, which on my 1 to 10 scale is good. So by that metric, it wasn't a great year in terms of the quality of books that I read, despite the fact that I now put so much research into deciding on which books I read, because I don't want to read bad books anymore. Life is too short. I want to make sure that I'm spending my time reading books that I think I'm just going to love. So the problem is, despite this research I've done, I've somehow only managed to come up with an average rating of 6.3 for the year. So I guess I need to keep working on trying to find books that are going to be great books for my reading tastes. Now, in terms of genres, I read 5 different genres throughout the year. Now, in the past couple of years, I've really dove hard into the fantasy genre. I would say prior to 2 or 3 years ago, I would mostly alternate between reading contemporary fiction and nonfiction and sort of go back and forth between the two as I was reading my books. However, in the past couple of years, in my desire to escape my life and send my mind off elsewhere, I have been really embracing the fantasy genre a lot more. And so in 2021, the most books that I read were in the fantasy genre. I read a total of 7 fantasy books. Now, I also read some science fiction. So I read 3 science fiction books, the Dune trilogy specifically. And then in each of the other 3 genres, I read 2 books each. So I read 2 that were contemporary fiction. I read 2 horror, which surprised me because I thought that The Last House on Edith Street was the very first horror novel that I've ever read. However, when I went back to look at the year, I realized that Joyland by Stephen King is also classified as horror, which I never really thought about it as a horror book because while there were some supernatural elements to it, it didn't really feel like a horror story to me, so I didn't really consider it to be a horror story. However, when I was looking at its official classification, it did show up in the horror category. So I read 2 horror books and then I read 2 nonfiction books. Now I thought it would be interesting to take those 5 categories and break down my average rating by category, by genre, to see which genre was the biggest success for my personal reading. And here's what's really interesting. My lowest genre category, well, there's a tie for 2 of them, but fantasy was one of the lowest with an average rating of 6 out of 10 for the fantasy books I read in 2021, which was really interesting considering it was also my most popular genre. The other genre that got 6 out of 10 was my contemporary fiction books. With those books, I only read 2 of them. One of them was a 10 out of 10, and the other was a 2 out of 10. So they were kind of on extreme opposite ends of the scale there, and they average out to 6 out of 10. Next up was horror, where my average rating was 6.25 out of 10. Then science fiction, where my average rating was 6.5 out of 10. And finally, my most successful genre was nonfiction, where the average rating was 7.25 out of 10, which I think is kind of interesting. Oh, I should note that when I read a series like the Dune trilogy or the Lacanius trilogy, I do give the series a single rating for the entire series, which when I then break it down by book, basically each book in the series gets the exact same rating, because I find it hard to separate out and rate individual books in a series that is, in essence, one long story that, if you were to bind it all up, would be a single book, I guess. So those are the stats of my reading year. Before I go on to talk about my worst books and best books of the year, let me just tell you how excited I am to have a new Patreon supporter. Saver Girl recently decided to support me on Patreon, which really makes my day, my week, my whole month whenever I see that somebody new has joined my Patreon. And of course, I do want to thank all of my existing Patreon supporters, especially my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Osmondus, Paul, Mojo. With all of you having my back, I feel like I can get through another year of YouTubing. So I'm so grateful for your support and for your care for me. So thank you. Now moving on to the worst books of the year. I'm going to look at my 3 worst and my 3 best. So starting with the worst, and number 3, going in order of least worst to worst, we have number 3, which is Joyland by Stephen King, a book that I rated 5.5 out of 10. Joyland was the first Stephen King novel I've ever read. I've only previously read one of his other books, a book called On Writing, which is a nonfiction memoir / guide to writing for new authors. I really liked On Writing. I thought it was a great book. However, I wasn't overly thrilled with Joyland. Now, of course, I do recognize that that's not one of his big titles that everybody talks about. He has a lot of very popular books, and I've never read any of them. So all I can say is that Joyland was not a big hit with me. It was just okay. But getting into the realm of the truly bad, at number 2, there is The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe, which I rated 2.5 out of 10. That was a book and a video where I've received probably the most negative comments on any video I've ever made on YouTube due to the fact that I spoke poorly about The Shadow of the Torturer. It seems to upset a lot of people. I mean, I delete any comments that are truly nasty, and other than that, if people disagree with me, that's okay, as long as they're at least reasonably polite and respectful about it. But yeah, there were a lot of unhappy people with the fact that The Shadow of the Torturer just didn't hit for me. It was just a weird book. It was the first of a series of 4 books, and I just DNF'd the rest of the series after the first one. And whatever it was, the weirdness and the whole style of the book just didn't fit with me at all for whatever reason. But the number 1 worst of the worst for 2021 was The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. This is a book that I rated 2 out of 10, and it was just one of those books that started off depressing, the middle was depressing, and I thought, this is a popular book. Surely there must be some kind of redemption towards the end of the book to make it all worthwhile. But no, the ending was depressing. The whole thing was depressing, and for me there just wasn't any redeeming qualities about it, other than the fact that it was a historical fiction book and it was an interesting look at Afghanistan from that kind of historical perspective. But as a story, my goodness, it was just miserable, oppressive, depressing, just not a fun read at all. But leaving behind the worst, let's get into the best of the year. And again, I'll do my top 3, building up towards the best of the year. And in at number 3, we have Waterloo Voices 1815 by Martin Beardsley. This was one of my nonfiction reads of the year, and it was a book about contemporary accounts from soldiers and other participants or observers of the Battle of Waterloo. It was the real voices of people who were there and experienced that battle. And so it really brought that pivotal moment of history to life, because we got to hear in their own words what it was like to experience it. When it comes to reading history, I'm always very fascinated by contemporary accounts, by going back in history and hearing from the people who lived that history and what their experiences were like. So it was a very cool book for my tastes. At number 2, we have a fantasy book, a standalone, in fact, called Tigana by Guy Gabriel Kay, who is one of my favorite authors of all time. Tigana was a big epic fantasy, all contained within a single book, and Kay's writing usually really resonates with me. There have been some misses with a few of his books in the past, but for the most part, I really love how he takes sort of historical fiction, but moves it into his own fantasy world and sprinkles a bit of light fantasy on top of it. It's very interesting that he takes these real world places, settings, people, and just puts his own touch on it and sort of turns it into a bit of a fantasy experience. So Tigana was a hit. It wasn't one of my favorite Guy Gabriel Kay novels, but it was one that I did enjoy quite a bit. And then my number 1 book of the year was not a fantasy novel. It wasn't a nonfiction novel. It was a contemporary fiction book called Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. This book took me completely by surprise. I expected a fun, fairly light read. What I got was definitely a fun read, but it covered some really deep themes. Specifically, it covered the theme of suicide, which I was not expecting. And yet it managed to do that with a very funny and entertaining story. So just the way it was written, it really charmed me and made me think at the same time. So I would never have expected this to be my number 1 book of the year or a 10 out of 10 rating, but there you go. I might have to look up some more Frederick Bachman in the future. If you've read his books, let me know which one I should check out next, because I'm definitely curious to try something else by him. So I'm just going to put up on the screen here a list of all the books I read in 2021 and all of the ratings out of 10 that I gave these books, just so you can see the full picture. Obviously, I've covered 6 out of the 16 with the 3 worst and 3 best, but here are the rest of them if you're curious in pausing the video to have a look at them. Every single one of these books has its own video on my channel, so you can go back through the videos I've read this year, and any of these books that you might be curious about, go ahead and look it up, check out the video, and see what I think about it. So that's my reading year in a nutshell. What I want to know is, what is your favorite book that you read last year? Is it something you think that I might enjoy and that I should add to my TBR? Please do let me know in the comments. And as always, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following. Give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers. Double the in the past couple of years, I've really dove I do rate the we start, and so it really brought